Ah, my child, come closer. As we warm ourselves by the fire, let me tell you a story that carries the dust of thousands of years. Today I invite you to a historical scene that drapes over the ancient lands of Britain. The year is 410 AD. As the shadows of the Roman Empire fade from Britain, the island. This is where the story begins. A great void. The mighty legions of the empire are no more. And these ancient lands are starting to tremble under the footsteps of new tribes carried by foreign winds, the Anglo-Saxons. Warrior peoples from beyond the North Sea, bringing both hope and fear to Britain. Today I'll take you on a journey to the first Anglo-Saxons who set foot on these shores. I'll tell you how they arrived, how they encountered the native Britons, and how they established their kingdoms here. This story isn't just about war and conquest. It's also about culture, faith, and resilience. Relax by the fire and listen to the echoes of the past. Let's begin. Ah, my child, now I will take you to the tumultuous period that changed the fate of the British lands, when Rome, which had long held sway over this island, finally withdrew. Imagine this, lands that had been part of Rome for 3.5 centuries, suddenly left in the shadowless world of a vast empire, no longer there. What a transformation. What a deep upheaval this was. The year is 410 AD. The Roman Empire is cracking from within, shaken by barbarian invasions and crushed by enemies from every corner. The Visigoths, under Alaric's leadership, are battering the gates of Rome, while the Vandals, Franks, and Burgundians all await their turn to tear apart Roman lands. In such chaos, the only thing Emperor Honorius can do is recall his soldiers from distant lands to ensure the survival of the empire. And this, my child, was a turning point for Britain. This beautiful island had been protected by Rome's powerful legions for centuries, adorned with roads, forts, and cities. But when Rome's mighty legions withdrew one by one from Britain, all that remained was a vast emptiness. The native people, who had prospered under Roman protection, were suddenly left alone and vulnerable. British leaders struggled to maintain the order that Rome had once provided. As cities slowly crumbled, chaos began to spread across the countryside. And the people, when they woke up one morning, they realized there were no longer legions to protect them. The shining armor of their warriors, the banners of the legions waving in the wind, all became memories. The people of Britain realized they had to defend themselves from raiders. But in the midst of the turmoil, distinguishing friend from foe grew more and more difficult. Rome's withdrawal didn't just leave a political and military void on the island, but it also caused a spiritual collapse. Among the people, the departure of Rome came to be seen as the abandonment of Britain by the gods themselves. This wasn't just a physical absence, but the closing of an era. The order of Rome had ended, and amidst the ruins of the old world, the sparks of a new age began to flicker. And it was at this point that the Anglo-Saxon tribes set their eyes on Britain. The rich lands left behind by Rome became an opportunity for the warrior peoples of the north. But for the Britons, the realization of this opportunity meant more upheaval and struggle. Ah, my child, here the story takes a new turn. And this new path would be written in both blood and hope. Ah, can you feel the winds of the north, my child? Those winds have carried people across lands for thousands of years, shaping civilizations and forging destinies. Now, I will take you to the origins of the Anglo-Saxon tribes, which would radically change the future of Britain. This story begins in the misty and rugged lands of northern Europe, in the ancient homelands of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. The Angles came from the Angeln region, located in what is now southern Denmark and the northwestern part of Germany, a land often surrounded by swamps, harsh and windy. They were a people who had learned to survive in this tough geography, becoming masters of the seas. The Saxons, on the other hand, were a brave and resilient community, living along the Elbe River in northern Germany. The name Saxon comes from their most important weapon, The Sax, a short sword. What can be said about a people whose name comes from their weapon? It speaks volumes about their warrior spirit. And finally, the Jutes, a people who had been shaped by the waves of the North Sea, rooted in what is now the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark. The common trait among these three tribes was their mastery of the seas. The choppy waters of the North Sea were not a barrier for them, but a pathway. As goods like furs, fish, and amber, the northern pearls, traveled along trade and migration routes, those same routes became gateways for cultures, languages, and ideas to flow. My child, to understand the lives of these tribes, we must not forget the harsh realities of that time. To survive, one had to keep moving, to find new lands. No matter how rich the land one was born into, as the population grew, resources dwindled, and new horizons had to be sought. This is why the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes prepared their ships and set sail for distant lands, sometimes welcomed with friendship, sometimes greeted with swords. But these migration routes were not just physical journeys. As they crossed the seas, these people didn't just carry themselves, they carried their cultures, beliefs, languages, and ways of life. The ancient children of the North Sea brought with them the elements that would shape the identity of Britain in the future. Now, think about this. How did the story of these tribes not only affect their own history, but also the fate of Britain and even Europe? To find the answer to that, you must listen patiently to the rest of our tale, for what comes next is filled with both conflict and new beginnings. My child, the chaotic years that began with the Roman withdrawal from Britain opened the doors to the great waves of migration in history. Now, I will take you back to those ancient times, when the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes first set foot on the shores of Britain. The ships gliding through the waves of the North Sea carried not only people, but also the seeds of a new age. Around the year 410 AD, when the Roman Empire withdrew its military forces from Britain, the eastern coasts of the island were left defenseless. The native Britons had grown accustomed to the comfort of the protection once provided by Rome, but now the Roman legions were gone, replaced by strange-shaped boats appearing on the barren shores. These boats were long ships carrying the Anglo-Saxon tribes. Among the first arrivals were the Saxons and the Jutes, who settled in areas like modern-day East Anglia, Kent, and Hampshire, viewing these shores as fortresses. The tribes that arrived in Britain chose fertile lands for settlement, areas near water sources. The Angles established colonies along the rivers in the east. The Saxons settled in what is now Sussex and Wessex, while the Jutes shaped their lands around Kent. For these people from the cold northern lands, the lands of Britain were like a new hope for a better life. But these lands already had inhabitants, the native Britons. The Britons, a people who, after centuries of Roman rule, still clung to their Celtic traditions, greeted the newcomers with both hesitation and resistance. Initially, some of the local leaders attempted to make peaceful agreements with the Anglo-Saxons. Some hired them as mercenaries, while others armed themselves to protect their lands. However, these relations often turned into bloody conflicts after brief periods of peace. In the early encounters, the Anglo-Saxons pushed the native Britons both culturally and militarily. The disciplined war tactics and effective, simple lifestyle of the Anglo-Saxons made it easier for them to gain superiority over the Britons. However, these first contacts were not only filled with conflict. Trade, cultural exchanges, and even intermarriage were also part of the story. As the native Britons learned the new farming methods and metalworking techniques brought by the Anglo-Saxons, traces of Briton culture began to mix into the Anglo-Saxon communities. Do not forget, my child, no migration is a simple journey. On one hand, there are new hopes, on the other, old traditions. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxon tribes marked a deep wound in Britain's fate, but every wound adds a new line to the grand story we call history. These early waves of migration were the beginning of a great transformation that would shape Britain's future identity. And so, the story of the Anglo-Saxons began to carve its mark on Britain's destiny. Ah, my dear child, there are stories carried by the northern winds that live not only in history books but also in the minds and hearts of people. Now, I will take you to the legendary tale of two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, who became symbols of the Anglo-Saxon arrival in Britain. This is the story of not just a migration, but the legendary birth of a culture and a people. For many, the story of Hengist and Horsa begins at a point where history and mythology intertwine. The names of these two brothers frequently appear in sources about the time when the Anglo-Saxons first set foot in Britain. While historians continue to debate whether they were real figures or merely heroes of legend, the influence of these figures has been a part of the Anglo-Saxon identity for centuries. According to the legend, Hengist and Horsa were the first leaders to bring the Saxons to Britain. After the Roman Empire's withdrawal left Britain vulnerable, a local Briton leader named Vortigern sought mercenaries to strengthen the island's defenses. He contacted the Saxons, living at the other end of the North Sea, and requested their warrior tribe's assistance. Hengist and Horsa answered the call and sailed their ships to the shores of Britain. Arriving on the island with magnificent ships, these brothers brought not only their soldiers but also their culture. Hengist stood out as a wise leader with his strategic intelligence, while Horsa was known for his bravery and strength on the battlefield. They were not just mercenaries, but figures who would shape the future of a people. Initially allies to the Britons, the brothers soon clashed with the native population. Hengist, dissatisfied with the land Vortigern had given them, demanded more territory, driven by his desire to dominate the eastern coasts of Britain. The climax of the legend lies in the relationship between Hengist and Vortigern. According to the story, Hengist increased his influence in Britain by marrying his daughter Rowena to Vortigern. This marriage was both a political maneuver and a symbol of a brief peace between the two peoples. However, this peace did not last long. Under the leadership of Hengist and Horsa, the Saxons gained more power in Britain, and conflict became inevitable. During these conflicts, Horsa lost his life and was immortalized as a war hero among the Anglo-Saxons. Hengist, however, continued his struggle as the leader of the Saxons, and eventually established a strong kingdom in Kent. Their story is a reflection of the process by which the Anglo-Saxon tribes that came to Britain began to unite and gain strength. But my dear child, the story of Hengist and Horsa is not just a historical narrative. For the Anglo-Saxon people, these two brothers became symbols of courage, leadership, and a new beginning. Their names have been mentioned in sagas and folk songs, passed down through generations as mythical representatives of the migration waves. The tale of Hengist and Horsa symbolizes a people's establishment in new lands, their struggles, and their victories. This story is like a call that resonates within history. In every detail, the shadow of the past and the hope of the future are hidden. As you listen to the heroic tale of Hengist and Horsa, remember that these two brothers represent not just history, but the spirit of a people. For legends are the reverberating heartbeats of history. Ah, my dear child, now I wish to take you on a journey through the mists of time, to a turbulent period when the Anglo-Saxon tribes first set foot on Britain's shores and confronted its native people. After Rome's protective shield was withdrawn, Britain was left as defenseless as a lamb, exposed to the jaws of hungry wolves. Yet, even in such a time, there was a glimmer of hope in the land, a hope that lived on under the shadow of a leader, a figure who inspired legends, King Arthur. After the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, the Celtic people fought valiantly to defend their land. Britain leaders built fortresses in the west and north, attempting to fortify their defenses. Regions like Wales and Cornwall became strongholds of Celtic resistance. During this time, a series of charismatic leaders rose among the Celts. They became known not only for their swords, but also for the words that kept their people's spirits alive. However, my dear child, at the heart of this resistance, there was one name that grew amidst the mist of history: Arthur. You may ask, was Arthur real or was he merely a legend? Well, this question has occupied the minds of historians and storytellers for centuries. Whether Arthur was a real leader or a product of the Celtic imagination remains unknown. But his name has become a symbol of the Celtic struggle. Legends tell of Arthur as a warlord who resisted the advancing Anglo-Saxons. According to these tales, Arthur and his loyal warriors, the Knights of the Round Table, fought epic battles all across the island. The Battle of Mons Badonicus is the most famous of these. While there is debate about the historical truth of this battle, sources suggest that the Celts succeeded in temporarily halting the Anglo-Saxon advance. Arthur's leadership gave his people hope and transformed the resistance into a legend. The Arthurian legend is not only a story of resistance, but also a symbol of justice, honor, and loyalty. His magical sword, Excalibur, is said to have been given to him by the Lady of the Lake. This sword represents the power Arthur carried as he fought for his people. Additionally, elements like the Land of Avalon and the Round Table shaped not only the story of a leader, but also the imagination of an entire culture. The Celtic people believed Arthur was not just a king, but their savior. Although the Anglo-Saxons eventually became dominant in Britain, Arthur's story was never forgotten. The legend has lived on through the centuries as a reflection of the people's resilience, faith, and love of freedom. Ah, my dear child, history sometimes blends truth and myth together. The story of King Arthur represents the hope and resistance of the British people during the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Even today, when we speak of Arthur, we remember not just a king, but an immortal symbol of resistance and faith. Remember, legends do not only tell the past, they also illuminate the future. And that is why Arthur's story will always be worth telling. Ah, my dear child. Now let me take you to a time when the Anglo-Saxon tribes began to take root in Britain, gradually altering the landscape of the island. These people were not just invaders, they were settlers, farmers, and the founders of a new order. Come, let us examine how this expansion unfolded. With the withdrawal of Rome, the fertile lands of Britain caught the attention of the Anglo-Saxons. The Thames and Trent valleys were at the heart of this expansion. These regions were of great strategic and agricultural importance. The rivers were not only ideal for travel and trade, but also provided perfect locations for establishing new villages. Imagine a village by a river would have easy access to both water and transport routes. It was these advantages that the Anglo-Saxons used to build their new homes. The settlements were typically small, simple structures. Anglo-Saxon villages were surrounded by houses made of wood and thatch. At the center of these villages was often a large mead hall, a place not only for eating but also for telling stories, making decisions, and strengthening community bonds. Their agricultural systems were highly effective. Fields were typically cultivated using a three-field crop rotation system, which helped maintain soil fertility. The Anglo-Saxons grew staple crops like barley, wheat, and oats, supporting their livelihood with livestock as well. But my dear child, the strength of a society does not only come from its land, but from the loyalty of its people and the order of their society. For the Anglo-Saxons, family, clan, and community bonds were the cornerstones of life. Every individual found their identity through the clan to which they belonged, gaining security and support from it. The family was not only a blood tie, but also the basic economic and social unit of society. At the head of the clans was often an elder, a wise leader. These leaders gained respect not only through their warrior status, but also through their fair decisions and their ability to look after the interests of their people. Alongside the leaders, warriors were the most respected members of society. For the Anglo-Saxons, being a warrior was not merely a profession, but an honor. Anglo-Saxon youths were raised with courage and loyalty from childhood. However, my dear child, one of the most remarkable features of Anglo-Saxon society was its collective approach to decision-making. Public assemblies, called the witan, played an important role. The witan was a platform where the people consulted their leaders and discussed significant matters. No important decisions were made without the approval of the witan, no matter how powerful the king or leader was. This was, by the standards of the time, quite a progressive form of governance. The social hierarchy was clear and rigid. Society was divided into three main classes: the nobles, aoral, The free farmers, Leol, and the slaves, Veol. The nobles took on roles in warfare and leadership while the free farmers worked the land. The slaves were mostly captives and formed the lower strata of society. Despite these class differences, every individual was valued as part of the community. In the end, my dear child, the order that the Anglo-Saxon settlers created in Britain was shaped not only by physical structures, but also by social bonds. Their agricultural skills, communal solidarity, and leadership principles left a legacy that would lay the foundations for Britain's future in the centuries to come. Even today, traces of these villages and social structures can still be seen, much like an old song whispered to us by history. Ah, my child, are you ready for the next story? Ah, my dear child, let me take you to a pivotal moment in British history, the period of the Heptarchy. This is the time when the island was divided into 7 powerful kingdoms, and the Anglo-Saxon people began to shape their identities and build their power. Come, let's explore the story of each kingdom and the political dynamics of this era together. With the withdrawal of the Romans, a power vacuum was created in Britain, wasn't it? And so the Anglo-Saxon tribes moved in to fill that gap. What began as local tribal leadership structures eventually transformed into full-fledged kingdoms. Essex, Sussex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent. Each one created its own borders, traditions, and leaders. In the south, 3 kingdoms were formed by the waves of Anglo-Saxon settlement: Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Essex means the land of the East Saxons, and Sussex means the land of the South Saxons. These kingdoms emerged in areas densely populated by Saxon people. Sussex had an advantage in trade due to its position by the coast, while Essex stood out for its agricultural land. Wessex, this kingdom, the land of the West Saxons, would eventually etch its name in British history in golden letters. Wessex was not just a kingdom, it would become the cornerstone of the united structure of England. However, at the time it was navigating a balance between alliances and conflicts with the other southern kingdoms. East Anglia was home to the East Anglos, a people who held dominion over the fertile lands in the east and were a major agricultural production center. The Angles were also skilled in maritime trade. The trade routes along the North Sea brought significant economic prosperity to East Anglia. Mercia, the border kingdom, was located in the heart of Britain. The story of Mercia is different from the others due to its size and political influence. The rulers of Mercia frequently engaged in border struggles with neighboring kingdoms, trying to expand their territory. Over time, this kingdom would become one of the most powerful political forces in Anglo-Saxon Britain. Northumbria, as its name suggests, was located to the north of the Humber River. This kingdom held significant cultural and religious importance. Centers like the Lindisfarne Monastery were not just religious hubs, but also the heart of education and art. The leaders of Northumbria often had to fight against the Scots and Picts to establish dominance in the northern parts of Britain. Kent was the settlement region of the Jutes, who migrated to Britain during the Anglo-Saxon migrations. Due to its geographic location, Kent had strong ties to Europe. Dear child, Kent was also one of the first places where Christianity began to spread again in Britain. When St. Augustine arrived in Canterbury, the kings of Kent embraced this new faith, securing a special place in history. These 7 kingdoms began as independent entities, but over time they became a political stage full of alliances and enmities. Each kingdom struggled to expand its borders and assert dominance over the others. It was a period filled with wars, alliances, and betrayals. But my child, these kingdoms didn't just influence each other through warfare, they also impacted each other through cultural and social innovations. Language, traditions, and laws were shaped during this period, laying the foundation for what would become England in the future. The Heptarchy period was a time when Britain found its identity, Anglo-Saxon culture took root, and the first steps towards unity were taken. Britain, with its rich history filled with the stories of these kingdoms. Would you like to learn more about the leadership struggles of these kingdoms in more detail? Ah, my dear child. Let me take you to the easternmost part of Anglo-Saxon Britain, to the Kingdom of Kent, which stretches along the shores of the North Sea. This kingdom wasn't just a political power, but also a land that left a deep mark on Britain's spiritual history. Come, let's explore the rise of Kent and the religious transformation that began with the arrival of St. Augustine. Kent was founded as a result of the migration of the Jute people to Britain. Unlike other Anglo-Saxon tribes, the Jutes settled in the southeast of the island, the area closest to Europe. Kent's strategic location made it a key center in trade routes. This sea trade brought Kent not only wealth, but also a cultural link to the outside world. The kings of Kent skillfully took advantage of this advantageous position. The kingdom's capital, Canterbury, was surrounded by vast agricultural lands and had a rich economy. But Kent's real strength lay in its diplomacy and international relations. Its ties with the Frankish kings on the continent gave this kingdom importance beyond its own borders. Now here comes the most important turning point in the story. In the year 597 AD, at the command of Pope Gregory, a group of missionaries set out from Rome, led by St. Augustine. He was a brave, determined man dedicated to introducing Christianity to Britain. After a long journey, Augustine and the monks arrived in Kent. But why Kent? Because here there was an opportunity waiting for St. Augustine. At the time, the king of Kent, Ethelbert, was not unfamiliar with Christianity. His wife, Queen Berthutha, a Frankish princess, was already a Christian and practiced her faith secretly in a small church in Canterbury. Augustine took advantage of this situation and began his efforts to convert Ethelbert and the people of Kent to the new faith. My dear child, Canterbury wasn't anything special back then. But St. Augustine transformed it into a spiritual capital. With the support of Ethelbert, Augustine established a bishopric in Canterbury and laid the foundations for Christianity in Britain. The church Augustine founded became the cornerstone of the famous Canterbury Cathedral, which still stands today. Canterbury quickly became not only Kent's but all of Britain's religious center. St. Augustine didn't just spread Christianity here, he also promoted unity among the Anglo-Saxon communities. Christianity in this era of warfare and division brought hope and a quest for order to Britain. Dear child, the arrival of St. Augustine in Britain was not just a religious transformation, it was also a cultural and social revolution. Thanks to Augustine's work, the Kingdom of Kent became an example to the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Christianity slowly spread across the island, new churches were built, and a new chapter was opened in Britain's history. St. Augustine left Britain with a spiritual legacy. The transformation he started not only changed a people's faith, but also their identity. Canterbury Cathedral stands as a tangible symbol of this legacy, standing tall for centuries. My child, the history of Kent teaches us this. Sometimes a king's power doesn't lie in his sword, but in a heart filled with faith and wisdom. Augustine and Ethelbert are the finest examples of this lesson. Now, take a cup of tea and feel the echoes of this story within your soul. Britain's spiritual journey is just my dear child. Now let me take you to the north of Anglo-Saxon Britain, to the powerful land of Northumbria rising from the mists. This kingdom was not only a star in the Anglo-Saxon world because of its victories on the battlefield, but also for its cultural and spiritual influence. Northumbria was a beacon of light shining through the shadows of the Dark Ages. Come, let's explore the rise of this land and the unique place of Lindisfarne Monastery in this story. Northumbria was initially made up of two separate kingdoms, Mercia and Dera. However, these two regions were united under King Edwin's leadership at the beginning of the 7th century. Edwin was not only a warrior but also a master of diplomacy and strategy. During his reign, Northumbria became the most powerful kingdom in Anglo-Saxon Britain. The strength of this kingdom was not only in the size of its army, Its strategic location on trade routes made Northumbria an economic powerhouse. Connections with Ireland and Europe across the sea turned it into a center of cultural exchange. In Northumbria, wealth wasn't just measured in gold. Here, knowledge and wisdom were counted as treasures too. My dear child, now our story takes us to a sacred place, Lindisfarne Island. This island witnessed the construction of a monastery in 635 AD, following the conversion of Northumbria's King Oswald to Christianity. Lindisfarne Monastery was founded at Oswald's request by Saint Aidan, a monk from Ireland. This was the turning point not only in Northumbria's, but also in all of Britain's spiritual history. The monastery stood in the middle of the sea, isolated from the world. However, this solitude became an advantage for spiritual depth. Saint Aidan and the monks who followed him worked to spread Christianity and educate the people here. Lindisfarne became not only a center for worship, but also a cradle for knowledge and the arts. Lindisfarne Monastery gave the world the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the greatest treasures of Anglo-Saxon culture. This manuscript was not just a religious text, but also a reflection of the art and craftsmanship of the time. Each page was adorned with delicate craftsmanship and deep faith. The gold, blue, and green colors danced across the pages, making the work almost as sacred as a prayer. The monastery also became a key point for the spread of Christianity in Britain. St. Aidan's humble leadership won the hearts of the people, making Northumbria a spiritual center. His successor, St. Cuthbert, further elevated the monastery's reputation, and Lindisfarne became an unmatched pilgrimage site in the Anglo-Saxon world. My dear child, the story of Northumbria shows us not just how a kingdom can rise, but how a people can rise and spread light to the world. These lands carry the story of a legacy built not by sword, but by wisdom and faith. Lindisfarne Monastery still echoes in the pages of history as a symbol of Northumbria's spiritual ascent. And so, my child, the rise of Northumbria is a story that inspires not only Britain, but all of Europe's history. Now, take a moment and imagine this story in your mind. Who knows, maybe the spirit of Northumbria still whispers through the winds of these lands. My dear child, now let me take you to the heart of the Anglo-Saxon world, to the vast and fertile lands of Mercia. The kingdom of Mercia was a cornerstone in Anglo-Saxon Britain. It was neither a spiritual center like the Northumbria to the north, nor an early Christian stronghold like Kent to the south. Mercia was known for its toughness and stubbornness. Its story was written with the clash of swords and the fire of ambition. And one of the most unforgettable figures in this kingdom's history was a king named Penda. Now let's explore Mercia's expansionist policies and Penda's role in this story. Mercia takes its name from the Old English word mirx, meaning border region. Indeed, this kingdom was situated at a crossroads of borders. To the west were the mountainous regions of Wales, and to the east lay the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Thanks to this strategic location, Mercia managed to increase its power both through trade and warfare. In the early 7th century, Mercia had neither established full hegemony nor fallen into complete disarray, but the potential of these lands was immense. Fertile valleys and rivers made Mercia both an agricultural hub and a key controller of Anglo-Saxon Britain's vital trade routes. The Thames and Severn rivers were not only crucial for wealth, but also for power. And now, my dear child, let's move on to the story of Penda, one of the darkest and perhaps most influential figures in Mercia's history. When Penda became king of Mercia in the mid-7th century, Britain's Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were embroiled in great struggles. Northumbria, under powerful leaders like Edwin and Oswald, was spreading Christianity and trying to expand its hegemony. But Penda stood as a stone in their path, resisting their rise. Interestingly, while Christianity was spreading across much of Britain, Penda chose to remain a pagan leader. His leadership symbolized the conflict between different belief systems in Anglo-Saxon Britain. Penda etched his name into history as both a warrior and an ideologue, resisting Christianity and striving to preserve pagan values. My dear child, throughout Penda's reign, Mercia's struggles with other kingdoms upset the political balance of Britain. His wars with Northumbria were especially noteworthy. Penda defeated powerful Northumbrian kings like Edwin and Oswald on the battlefield, elevating Mercia's power to its peak. These victories showcase not only Penda's military prowess, but also his determined and ruthless leadership. Penda didn't just fight Northumbria, he also clashed with other kingdoms such as Wessex and East Anglia. But his leadership went beyond warfare. Penda strengthened Mercia's internal structure and won the loyalty of his people. His adherence to paganism deepened his bond with the people, as it was not just a faith but a core part of Mercia's identity. With Penda's death, Mercia may have lost its fierce leader, but the kingdom continued to be a dominant force on the Anglo-Saxon political stage. Penda's legacy lived on not just in battlefield victories, but also in the cultural and political identity of Mercia. The story of Mercia is not only the story of a kingdom, but also of a people and a belief. Penda's resistance and leadership were like a shining star in the dark ages of history. Now, my dear child, let us once again bring this glorious past of Mercia to life in our thoughts and offer a salute to Penda's courageous spirit. Who knows, perhaps his echoes still whisper in the winds of Mercia. My dear child, the roaring sounds of swords on the battlefield and the delicate dance of diplomatic negotiations. These two concepts lie at the very heart of Anglo-Saxon Britain, war and diplomacy. Today, I will tell you about the complex relationships between these small but fierce kingdoms. For these relationships shaped not only the fate of the lands, but also the lives of the people. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and others, were constantly in competition with one another. Each kingdom fought with both swords and words to gain superiority over the others. Alliances were often formed out of necessity. When one kingdom faced a powerful enemy, it sought the support of another kingdom. However, these alliances were often temporary. Kings who fought side by side one day could find themselves as enemies on the battlefield the next. The struggles between Mercia and Northumbria provide some of the clearest examples of this. They engaged in bloody battles and intricate diplomatic games to outmaneuver one another. Penda's campaigns against Northumbria, or King Oswald of Northumbria's diplomatic finesse, are striking examples of this rivalry. But war was not only fought with swords, my dear. Marital ties were one of the strongest foundations of alliances. When a king married his daughter to the leader of another kingdom, a temporary peace would be established between the two. Yet, the duration of this peace depended entirely on the interests of the parties involved. For the people of that time, a king was not only a leader but also a protector. A king's power came from his victories on the battlefield, his sense of justice, and his relationship with the gods. People often interpreted a king's failures as a sign of the gods' wrath. Thus, a king had to be both a warrior and a diplomat. This influence over the people further intensified the power struggles of the kings. The failure of a king could bring about not only his downfall, but also the collapse of his people. For the people of those times, their king's victory was intertwined with their own existence and identity. Therefore, the king's battle was, in essence, the battle of the people. Now, my dear child, let us look at the Britons, the people whom the Anglo-Saxons conquered. The Britons, descendants of the Celts, experienced great change with the invasion of these newcomers. As the Anglo-Saxons settled on Britain lands, a process of assimilation between the two cultures began. However, this process was not always peaceful. The culture of the Britons seeped into Anglo-Saxon society in many ways. Art, music, and legends were some of the areas where this interaction was most evident. For example, Celtic stonework and geometric patterns began to appear in Anglo-Saxon art. Additionally, Celtic priests and the early influences of Christianity helped shape the religious foundations of Anglo-Saxon society. Yet this cultural exchange was not always on equal terms. The Britons often faced discrimination, being treated as second-class citizens. Many Britons were forced to work in Anglo-Saxon settlements and began losing their language and traditions. Still, despite all of this, the spirit of Celtic culture did not vanish entirely. Many rituals and traditions in Anglo-Saxon society had Celtic roots. Under the rule of the Anglo-Saxons, the Britons slowly began to lose their identity. But this process was not one of total destruction, it was a transformation. While the Britons' language diminished under the influence of the Anglo-Saxons, their Christian faith played an important role in this transformation. My dear child, this story teaches us that conquest and assimilation are not merely wars of the sword, but also processes of transformation. The story of the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons still lives on in the spirit of this land. And this spirit, like a fabric woven by the coming together of two cultures and two peoples, echoes in the silent whispers of history. Now, my dear child, now close your eyes and imagine the cold, harsh waves of the North Sea. In the distance, sails filled with wind approaching the shore, ships carrying stories from distant lands along with their cargo. This is the beginning of the vital role the sea played in the Anglo-Saxon world. The sea was not just an obstacle to them, but a bridge, a trade route, and a defense line. Let us now explore the story of this seafaring people together. The Anglo-Saxons were a people at peace with the sea. It was both a necessity and a part of their way of life. Navigating the perilous waters of the North Sea required brave hearts and sturdy ships. And the Anglo-Saxons managed to do just that. Their ships were mostly made of wood, long and narrow, lightweight. These ships could maneuver easily both on rivers and in the open sea. With a single sail to support them, these ships also used oars when needed. This made the Anglo-Saxon sailors remarkably successful in both speed and agility. Ah, my child, the sea was not only the route for trade, but also the gateway to war. The Anglo-Saxons knew very well the importance of defending the coastline. Especially with the increasing Viking raids, coastal defenses became even more crucial. Coastal defense strategies were a combination of natural barriers and man-made fortifications. Coastal castles, watchtowers, and garrisons were constructed to detect enemy ships early and prepare for an attack. Additionally, harbors and trading points were usually built in strategically defensible locations. This shows how well prepared the Anglo-Saxons were against threats from the sea. Ah, dear child, the sea was not just a battlefield, it was also a trade route for great wealth. The North Sea was like an artery connecting the Anglo-Saxons with the rest of the world. Trade relations were of great importance, both locally and internationally. The Anglo-Saxons established strong trade connections, especially with other regions of Northern Europe. Areas like Flanders, Frisia, and Scandinavia were frequent trade partners. So, what was transported on these ships, you might wonder? Now, let your imagination soar, my child. Amber from the Baltic region, finely woven fabrics from Flanders, ceramics from Frisia, and even furs brought from Scandinavia. In exchange, the Anglo-Saxons offered their wealth in the form of metalwork, agricultural products, and wooden goods. This exchange was not just of goods, but also a pathway for cultural interaction. The sea played a significant role, not only in the lives of leaders, but also in the lives of the people. For those living in coastal villages, fishing was both a livelihood and a way of life. Fish like herring, mackerel, and salmon were staples on Anglo-Saxon tables. Additionally, salt obtained from the sea played a vital role in preserving food. Furthermore, coastal life created cultural influences. Legends about the sea frequently appeared in Anglo-Saxon folktales. These stories, about sea monsters, mysterious sailors, and traders from distant lands, shaped the imagination of the people. My dear child, the sea was a source of life, a test and a journey for the Anglo-Saxons. Their seafaring skills and trade networks were elements that shaped not only their society, but also the Europe of their time. Today, when you see a ship drifting on the cold waves of the North Sea, imagine the traces of the Anglo-Saxon sailors, for their legacy still echoes in the winds of the seas. Ah, my dear child, In this long journey we call history, there are certain moments that serve as turning points, altering the fate of entire peoples. Around the year 600 AD, this was such a moment for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The power relationships, alliances, and conflicts between these kingdoms would not only define the course of that time, but also shape the future of England itself. Now let us look at the struggles of the Anglo-Saxons during this period and examine the political landscape that emerged from them. In those years, the island of England witnessed both the destructive force of war and the mastery of political intelligence. Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Kent. These 7 kingdoms, known as the Heptarchy, were constantly embroiled in a struggle for power. Each of them fought with all their might to expand their borders and establish dominance over the others. Efforts to unite these kingdoms were not always peaceful, of course. Alliances were formed, wars were fought, and thrones were changed through bloody struggles. One of the most striking events of this period was the challenge posed by Mercia's powerful leader, Penda, to kingdoms like Wessex and Northumbria. But my child, remember, these kingdoms were also sometimes connected through clever marriages. A princess marrying the king of another kingdom could unite not only 2 dynasties but 2 kingdoms as well. To understand how fragile the balance of power was, you must examine this period carefully, dear child. Around 600 AD, Northumbria was becoming an increasingly powerful regional kingdom. Its military victories and cultural superiority set it apart from the others. Religious centers like Lindisfarne and literary works made Northumbria not only a military leader, but also a cultural one. Meanwhile, Mercia, under Penda's charismatic leadership, was growing stronger. To the southeast, Kent was evolving in a different direction due to the influence of Christianity, while Wessex was constantly pushing its borders to control more land. But remember, my child, during this time no kingdom had achieved absolute dominance. Each one had areas of strength. Some excelled in military matters, while others grew wealthy by controlling trade routes. The power struggle between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms resulted in a notable political balance in the 600s AD. However, this balance was also a calm before the storm, for Viking raids would soon upset these dynamics, and a new era would begin on the island. Until then, though, the kingdoms had drawn a boundary for their rivalry, creating a political map that would be remembered throughout the island's history. Dear listener, what a beautiful journey we've had, don't you think? The rise, struggles, and eventual power balance of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. All these stories live on, not just in the dusty pages of history, but in the very identity of this island today. You can find echoes of these tales in every stone, every riverbed, and every hill. Now, as I tell you these stories, I hope you can imagine the warriors walking on cold mornings, the people shopping in the marketplaces, or the priests whispering prayers within the walls of the church. For the magic of history lies right here. The past always connects us to the present. My child, this is where our story ends, but that does not mean we cannot begin another. Remember, history is like a river. As it flows, it offers us new paths, new bridges, and new stories. For now, farewell, but I am sure we will meet again soon. There is still so much more to tell.